Philosophy and Critical Theory. Prefatory remark. The essay on traditional and critical theory in the previous issue gave rise to extensive discussions. The significance of philosophy, really the question of the role of thinking in the present, formed the most important theme. Our discussions laid the basis for the following contributions. Max Horkheimer. In my essay, I pointed the distinction between two modes of knowing. The one, found in the Discours de la Méthode by Descartes, whose anniversary was celebrated earlier this year. The other, in the Critique of Political Economy. Traditional theory, in the sense established by Descartes, and which lives on in the activity of the specialized sciences today, organizes experience on the basis of questions that are posed in connection with the reproduction of life internal to present-day society. The system of the scientific discipline contains knowledge in a form that renders it applicable in as many situations as possible under the given circumstances. The social genesis of its problems, the real situations in which it is needed, and the purpose for which it is employed. These are taken to be external to science itself. The critical theory society, on the other hand, takes human beings as producers of the totality of their historical forms of life as its object. The relation of actuality from which science proceeds do not appear to it merely as mere givens, that its task is simply to observe and predict according to the law of probability. Whatever is, quote, given in any one case depends not on nature alone, but also on what human beings are capable of doing with nature and about it. The objects and mode of perception, the questions that are posed and the meaning of their answers, bears witness to human activity and the degree of its power. In relating what seems to be ultimate material facts, the same theory to which the specialist scholars conforms back to human productions, the critical theory society is in agreement with German idealism. Going back to Kant, this idealism asserted the validity of this dynamic moment against veneration of facts and the social conformism that accompanies it. As it is in mathematics, says Fichte, so it is in the Weltanschauung as a whole. The sole difference between that and constructing the world, one is conscious of their constructing it, for it is a matter of mere necessity, not freedom. This thought pervaded German idealism. However, it held this activity, which reveals itself in and through the given material, to be something merely intellectual or spiritual, something belonging to a super-empirical consciousness in itself, to an absolute I, to Geist as such. And so, the task of overcoming the dull, irrational side of this activity, devoid of consciousness, fell within the inner world of the person. It became a question of inward disposition. According to the materialist conception, however, this underlying activity is that of social labor, whose class-based form leaves its stamp on all modes of human reaction, including theory itself. The rational investigation of the processes in which cognition and its object alike are constituted, the subordination of these processes to conscious control, these do not therefore play out in the realm of pure spirit or intellect, but coincide with the struggle over determinate forms of life in actuality. The construction of theories, in the traditional sense, is something that defines a profession internal to the given society, demarcating it from other scientific and non-scientific activities. The traditional theory need not reckon with the historical objectives and tendencies with which the enterprise's scientific inquiry, including its own, is intertwined. Critical theory, however, in the formation of its categories and throughout all its phases of its development, consciously pursues the interest in the rational organization of human activity. The illumination and justification of this interest is the task of critical theory, has set for itself. For critical theory is concerned not merely with those purposes prescribed to thinking by pre-existing forms of life, but human beings with all their eventualities. In this sense, critical theory preserves not just the legacy of German idealism, but the legacy of philosophy itself. Critical theory isn't just another research hypothesis whose utility for business as usual remains to be seen, but rather an indissoluble moment in the historical striving to create a world that satisfies all the needs and powers of human beings. For all the reciprocity between the specialized sciences and critical theory, as critical theory must constantly reorient itself according to advances in scientific progress, and has in turn acted as a liberating influence and spur of the sciences for 70 years, Critical theory is nowhere interested solely in the accumulation of knowledge as such and for its own sake, but everywhere in the emancipation of human beings from enslaving social relations. And this, the task of critical theory, corresponds with that of ancient Greek philosophy, less to the philosophy of resignation from the Hellenistic period of decline than the kind of philosophy that flourished under Plato and Aristotle. In the wake of the failed political project of both philosophers, however, the Stoics and Epicureans withdrew into the elaboration of philosophical teachings for individual practice. In contrast, the modern dialectical philosophy preserves from both philosophers the insight that free development of individuals depends on the rational constitution of their society as a whole. Through the radical investigation of the conditions of the present, modern dialectical thinking becomes the critique of economy. Critique is not identical with its object, however. Political economy, for example, didn't simply crystallize out of philosophy. The mathematical curve of modern political economy are today just as incapable of maintaining any connection to the essential as the philosophical schools of positivism and existentialism. The fundamental concepts of economics have lost their relationship to the fundamental social relations of the epoch. Through rigorous investigations, has always required the isolation of certain structures, economic inquiry is no longer directed by the conscious, forward-looking, historical interest in society that may once have served as its guiding principle, as in the case of Adam Smith. The intimate connection between modern economic analysis and the totality of knowledge oriented towards the comprehension of historical actuality has disappeared. The work of establishing or restoring a relationship between analysis and actuality, between analysis and any real purpose, is left to others, left to be accomplished at some later date, or perhaps even left up to chance. As long as there's a social demand and social recognition for the sciences, their practitioners need not bother. Responsibility for addressing the problem is delegated to other disciplines, such as sociology or academic philosophy, both of which handed to others in turn. Thereby, the forces that come out on top in society, their respective forms of domination, are tacitly affirmed by science itself as the ultimate arbiters of meaning and value. Thereby, knowledge is declared powerless. In contradistinction to the activity of modern specialized sciences, however, the critical theory of society has remained philosophical, even as the critique of economy. Its content is formed by the reversal of concepts that dominate the economy into their opposites of fair exchange, into developing a social injustice, of free enterprise into the domination of monopoly, of productive labor into the calcification of production inhibiting relations, of the preservation of life as society as a whole into the immiseration of entire peoples. Critical theory is concerned less with what remains constant in this movement, however, than with the historical movement of the epoch that remains to be brought into a close. Capital is no less exact in its analysis than those of the political economy it criticizes, and yet even when it engages in the subtlest calculations of isolated, periodically recurrent processes, its driving motive remains insight into the historical course of the whole. This view towards the tendencies of society as totality, a perspective that remains decisive for critical theory, even in its most abstract, logical, and economic considerations, is not a uniquely philosophical subject matter that would distinguish it from other, purely special scientific approaches. The philosophical character of critical theory comes to the fore not just in its opposition to political economy in theory, but also in its opposition to economism in practice. The struggle against the harmonizing illusions of liberalism, the uncovering of its inherent contradictions, and the abstractness of its concept of freedom. All these moments of critical theory have been taken up down to the letter in the most diverse parts of the world, twisted into slogans of reaction. That the economy should serve human beings instead of dominating them is nowadays proclaimed by those who have always understood economy to mean their own shareholders. Oh, that's a great line. The social Ganz und Gemeinschaft are glorified where these concepts cannot even really be conceived any longer, except through the exclusion of their opposite. The individual, pure and simple, the individual is equated with the corrupt and degenerate social order, represented by those who would so condemn them. And the concept of the holy egoism and the vital interest of the imagined Volksgemeinschaft, the interest of actual human beings is the uninhibited unfolding of their powers, and the happiness of a life in common is mixed up with the power hungry of domineering social groups. The vulgar materialism of bad practice that dialectical materialism criticizes has become the true religion of the age, under the cover of idealistic slogans, the transparency of which only makes it more appealing to its most devoted followers. The specialist thinking is conscientious conformism, rejects any interconnection with so-called value judgments, and its unwavering purity maintains the separation between knowledge and position-taking. The nihilism of the powerful takes its disillusionment to heart, a complete and brutal seriousness in practice. For the powerful value judgments belong either in national poetry or before the people's courts, but never in the tribunals of thought. Critical theory, whose goal is the happiness of all individuals, cannot, quite unlike the scientific servants of the authoritarian states, reconcile itself with the continuing existence of human misery. The self-contemplation or self-intuition of reason, which, according to ancient philosophy, constituted the highest stage of happiness. This has in modern thinking turned into the materialist concept of a free and self-determining society. At the same time, the materialist conception preserves form from idealism, the thought of human possibility, extending beyond the confines of the existing order. Possibilities besides the accumulation of power and profit. That's a great way of putting it. Individual moments from critical theory reappear with inverted meaning in the opposing theory in practice, and so with the defeat of all progressive endeavors across the highly developed countries of Europe, the confusion has only continued to spread, even in the ranks of its bearers. The abolition of social relations that inhibit present-day development is indeed the next goal of historical struggle, but abolition, Affenbung, is a dialectical concept. The absorption of individual property into assets of the state, the expansion of industry, and even the widespread satisfaction of the masses are elements whose historical significance can only be determined by the nature of the whole of which they are part. Thus, however vital these elements might be in the face of the antiquated social conditions, they can always be drawn into a regressive movement. The old world is going to ground on an obsolete principle of economic organization. The collapse of culture is tied to this. The economy is the first and foremost cause of misery, and so theoretical and practical critique must first and foremost turn against it, but would be mechanistic and not dialectical, thinking to judge the forms of future society solely according to their economy. Historical transformation does not leave the relation between the spheres of culture untouched. Under the condition of the present, the economy dominates human beings, and is therefore the lever to which the society is to be overthrown. Should humans beings in the future, in their confrontation with the necessities of nature, determine the totality of their relationships for themselves, then isolated economic data cannot serve as the criteria by which their community is judged. This is also true for the period of transition insofar as politics wins a newfound autonomy relative to economics. Only once this period has come to an end will political problems be capable of resolution into questions of pure administration. Until then, however, everything could always still turn out differently. Even the character of the transition itself remains undetermined. That's a great way of putting it. Economism, to which critical theory is sometimes reduced, and of which it is often accused, I've never seen that before. I think only critical theorists would even know what this word means, to be honest, at this point. Consists not in ascribing too great an importance to economics, but too narrow. Its original, comprehensive significance disappears behind scattered references to circumscribed phenomena. According to critical theory, the economy of the present is essentially determined through the fact that products produced by human beings beyond the scope of their own needs are not directly handed over to society, but privately appropriated and utilized. The abolition of this condition is indeed meant in the sense of a higher principle of economic organization, and no mere philosophical utopia. The old principle of economic organization drives humanity onwards into one catastrophe after another, but the concept of socialization that designates that historical transformation at stake contains more than elements that fit nearly and neatly into political economy, or even jurisprudence. The subordination of industrial production to control by a state is a historical factum. However, the significance of this fact in any one case must still be analyzed in the spirit of critical theory. Whether, for instance, any socialization worthy of the name is taking place, that is, whether a higher principle has begun to unfold inside it, depends not only on the alteration of specific property relations or on the increase of productivity, through new forms of social cooperation, but on the essence of unfolding of the socializing of society as a whole. What it comes down to in the end is the precise nature of these new relations as production. Even if so-called quote-unquote natural privileges conditioned by differences in individual gifts and potentials persist at first, no new social privilege should rise to take its place. In the preliminary stages of the transition in particular, inequality cannot be allowed to harden, but must be overcome in increasing measure with a vigilance keener still. The problem of what is produced and how it is produced, the problem of whether relatively fixed groups with special interests persist, the problem of whether pre-existing social distinctions are clung to, or even deepened. Further, the problem of the relationship between each individual and the ruling power, the relationship between all decisive acts of administration, and the knowledge that the wills of all individuals affected by them, the dependence of all conditions that fall under human control on reaching genuine agreement between everyone concerned. In short, the problem of the degree of development of essential movements of real democracy and the association of free human beings. All of this belongs to the content of the concept of socialization. None of these determinations can be divorced from the economic sphere, and the critique of economism lies not in turning away from economic analysis, but in the insistence on bringing economic analysis to the point of completion, and into correct historical alignment. Yeah, I mean, just in case anyone wasn't aware, okay, the economy isn't just how much things cost, okay? The economy is all human social activity in a marketized commodity society, effectively. Dialectical theory imposes no critique from above it. It conducts no critique based on ideas alone. Even in its idealist shape, it dismisses the notion of any ideal good in itself that would simply be held over and against actuality as its criterion. Dialectical theory judges not according to the criterion of what is timeless, but what is timely. That is, what is its high time for. Yeah, so when Hegel says, okay, I think I have the quote wrong, but he says, like, all that is real is rational, all that's rational is real. Hegel is not saying every single thing in existence is necessarily good, rational. He has a weird, like, kind of thing where he's like, it's not really real, like, it's not really a state. Like, so, for example, if the state's irrational, it's not really being a state, is actually what Hegel means there, for example. In their approximation of the partial nationalization of private property, the Totalitarian states also appeal to community and to collective practices. Yeah, so it's like, the thing is, in the totalitarian mindset, though, the state is real. Whatever the state is, that is what the state is doing. That's like kind of a positivist way of looking at it, and the logic of that kind of allows you to go into full-on, like, authoritarian fascism, basically. Even if the state's, like, in a totally degenerated state, as long as it's appealing to this idea of a community or collective practice, that's all it needs to do. Because that's, like, kind of a positivistic way, a non-dialectical way of seeing the state. But in the case, the untruth of the appeal is immediately apparent. Even where socialization has begun in earnest, however, critical theory has the dialectical function of measuring each historical stage, not by reference to isolating numerical figures and abstract concepts, but against the measure of its own origin in total content. And so ensures this content is living. The right philosophy today consists not in withdrawing from concrete economic and social analyses into shallow and scattered categories, but, to the contrary, in guarding against the evaporation of economic concepts into shallow and scattered trivialities, suitable only for obscuring reality from all sides. Critical theory can never be completely absorbed into specialized economic science. The dependence of politics on the economy was its object, not its program. Amongst those who call upon the critical theory of society today, some debase it into a mere rationalization of their respective undertakings in full consciousness of doing so. Others cling on to its hollowed-out concepts, now unrecognizable even in their own wording, and turn the theory into a leveling ideology that everyone understands only because no one has to think about it at all. I wonder who he's talking about, because it's like, didn't he just create it? Like, what is he talking about in context? I'm honestly not sure. Maybe someone else knows, but I don't know I'm sure someone was doing this, but I just wonder who. Was it just like some obscure, Marxist guy? But since its inception, dialectical thinking has always been a mark of the most advanced stage of knowledge. In the end, the only one from which a decision can come. Its bearers have always been relatively isolated in times of reaction. This too is something it has in common with philosophy. As long as thinking has not finally triumphed, it can never feel secure in the shadow of any power. As long as thinking has not finally triumphed... Sorry, I got distracted. As long as thinking has not finally triumphed, it can never feel secure in the shadow of any power. It demands independence, while the concepts of critical theory, which originate from social movements, ring so hollow now that little more stands behind the theory than its persecutors. Their truth will yet out for the goal of a rational society, that today seems to be preserved in fantasy alone, is really lodged in every human being. This is no reassuring affirmation. I affirm nothing. The fulfillment of all possibilities depends on historical struggles. I added the comment there. The truth of the future is not a statement about given with a particular index. The will has its own role to play in this. It cannot allow itself to be lulled into complacency. If the prognosis is to come true, and even after the creation of the new society, the happiness of its members will never make up for the suffering of all who perish in society today. The theory affords no salvation for those who carry it, indissolubly bound to a determinate drive in a determinate will. The theory has no psychological condition of to preach. Like Stoicism or Christianity, the martyrs of freedom sought no ataraxia, no tranquility for their own souls. Their philosophy was politics. If their soul remained calm in the face of terror, that does not mean the calm was their goal. Not even their fear could bear witness against them. The apparatus of power has surely not become any cruder since Galileo's penance and recantation. If it lags somewhere behind other machinery in the 19th century, it has more than made up for the lost ground in the last few decades. In this too, the end of an epoch proves a return to the beginning on a higher level. Goethe once said, "The supreme felicity of Earth's children lies in personality alone." Just recently, another poet has added onto this, that its possession is also a social endowment and can be lost at any time. The fascist Pirandello knew his own time better than he himself knew. Under the totalitarian domination of the worst human beings might retain not just their own lives, but their own selves as well, by sheer coincidence. And recantation today means even less than it did during the Renaissance. Any philosophy that might find consolation for itself, repose in truth, can therefore have nothing to do with critical theory. Alright, next I'm reading from the same year as this, the comments, I think, made on it by Marcuse. It's also called Philosophy and Critical Theory, 1937. So it's pretty hard to find online, so I'm just going to combine them together here. From the beginning, the Critical Theory Society was constantly involved in philosophical as well as social issues and controversies. At the time of its origin, in the 30s and 40s of the 19th century, philosophy was the most advanced form of consciousness, and by comparison, real conditions in Germany were backward. Criticism of the established order there began as a critique of that consciousness, because otherwise it would have confronted its object at an earlier and less advanced historical stage than that which had already attained reality in countries outside Germany. Once critical theory had recognized the responsibility of economic conditions for the totality of the established world and comprehended the social framework in which reality was organized, philosophy became superfluous as an independent scientific discipline, dealing with the structure of reality. Furthermore, problems bearing on the potentialities of man and of reason could now be approached from the standpoint of economics. Philosophy thus appears within the economic concept of materialist philosophy, each of which is more than an economic concept of the sort employed by the academic disciplines of economics. It is more due to the theory's claim to explain the totality of man and his word in terms of social being. Yet, it would be false on that account to reduce these concepts to philosophical ones. To the contrary, the philosophical contents relevant to the theory are to be adduced from the economic structure. They refer to conditions that, when forgotten, threaten the theory as a whole. In the conviction of its founders, the Critical Theory Society is essentially linked with materialism. This does not mean that it thereby sets itself up as a philosophical system in opposition to other philosophical systems. The theory of society is an economic, not a philosophical system. There are two basic elements linking materialism to correct social theory: concern with human happiness, and the conviction that it can be attained only through a transformation of the material conditions of existence. The actual course of the transformation and the fundamental measures to be taken in order to arrive at a rational organization of society are prescribed by analysis of economic and political conditions in the given historical situation. The subsequent construction of the new society cannot be the object of theory, for it is to occur as the free creation of the liberated individuals. When reason has been realized as the rational organization of mankind, philosophy is left without an object. For philosophy, to the extent that it has been, up to the present, more than an occupation or a discipline within the given division of labor, has drawn its life from reasons not yet being reality. Reason is the fundamental category of philosophical thought, the only one of which it has bound itself to human destiny. Philosophy wanted to discover the ultimate and most general grounds of being. Under the name of reason, it conceived the idea of an authentic being in which all significant antitheses of subject and object, essence and appearance, thought and being were reconciled. Connected with this idea was the conviction that what exists is not immediately and already rational, but must rather be brought to reason. Reason represents the highest potentiality of man and of existence. The two belong together. For when reason is accorded the status of substance, this means that at its highest level, as authentic reality, the world no longer stands opposed to the rational thought of men as mere material objectivity. Rather, it is now comprehended by thought and defined as a concept. That is, the external antithetical character of material objectivity is overcome in a process through which the identity of subject and object is established as the rational conceptual structure that is common to both. In its structure, the world is considered accessible to reason, dependent on it, and dominated by it. In this form, philosophy is idealism. It subsumes being under thought. But through the first thesis that made philosophy into rationalism and idealism, it became critical philosophy as well. As the given world was bound up with rational thought, and indeed ontological dependent on it, all that contradicted reason, or was not rational, was posited as something that had to be overcome. Reason was established as a critical tribunal. In the philosophy of the bourgeois era, reason took on the form of rational subjectivity. Man, the individual, was to examine to judge everything given by the means of power of his knowledge. Thus, the concept of reason contains the concept of freedom as well, for such examination and judgment would be meaningless if man were not free to act in accordance with his insight and to bring what confronts him into accordance with reason. Philosophy teaches us that all properties of mind subsist only through freedom, that all are only means for freedom, and that all seek and produce only freedom. To speculate philosophy belongs the knowledge that freedom is that alone which is true of mind. I think you can tell that this is kind of a bourgeois conception of society. Hegel was only drawing conclusions from the entire philosophical tradition when he identified reason and freedom. Freedom is the formal element of rationality, the only form which reason can be. With the concept of reason as freedom, philosophy seems to reach its limit. What remains outstanding to the realization of reason is not a philosophical task. Hegel saw the history of philosophy as having reached its definitive conclusion at this point. However, this meant for mankind not a better future, but the bad present that its condition perpetuates. Kant had, of course, written essays on universal history with cosmopolitan intent and on perpetual peace, but his transcendental philosophy aroused the belief that the realization of reason, through factual transformation, was unnecessary, since individuals could not become rational and free within the established order. In its basic concepts, this philosophy fell prey to the order of the bourgeois epoch. In a world without reason, reason is the semblance of rationality. In a state of general unfreedom, freedom is only a semblance of being free. This semblance is generated by the internalization of idealism. Reason and freedom become tasks that the individual is to fulfill within himself, and he cannot do so regardless of external conditions. Freedom does not contradict necessity, but to the contrary, necessity presupposes it. Only he is free who recognizes the necessary as necessary, thereby overcoming its mere necessity and elevating to the sphere of reason. This is equivalent to asserting that a person born crippled, who cannot be cured at the given state of medical science, overcomes this necessity when he gives reason and freedom scope within his crippled existence, i.e., if from the start he always posits his needs, goals, and actions only as the needs, goals, and actions of a cripple. Idealist rationalism cancelled the given antithesis of freedom and necessity, so that freedom can never trespass upon necessity. Rather, it modestly sets up house within necessity. Hegel once said that this suspension of necessity transfigures necessity into freedom. Freedom, however, can be the truth of necessity only when necessity is already true in itself. Freedom, however, can be the truth of necessity only when necessity is already true in itself. Idealist rationalism's attachment to the status quo is distinguished by its particular conception of the relation of freedom and necessity. This attachment is the price it had to pay for the truth of its knowledge. It is already given in the orientation of the subject of idealist philosophy. The subject is rational only insofar as it is entirely self-sufficient. All that is other is alien and external to this subject, and as such principally suspect. For something to be true, it must be certain. For it to be certain, it must be posited by the subject as its own achievement. This holds equally for the fundamentum inconcussum of Descartes and the synthetic a priori judgments of Kant. Self-sufficiency and independence of all things is other and alien is the sole guarantee of the subject's freedom. What is not dependent on any other person or things, what possesses itself is free. Having excludes the other, relating to the other in such a way that the subject really reaches and is united with it or him, counts as lost independence. When Hegel ascribed to reason as authentic reality, movement that remains within itself, he could invoke Aristotle. From the beginning, philosophy was sure that the highest mode of being was being within itself. This identity is the determination of authentic reality, points to a deeper identity property. Something is authentic when it is self-reliant, can preserve itself, and is not dependent on anything else. For idealism, this sort of being is attained when the subject has the world so that it cannot be deprived of it, and it disposes of omnipresently, and that it appropriates it to the extent that that in all otherness, the subject is only with itself. However, the freedom attained by Descartes' ego cogito, Leibniz's monad, Kant's transcendental ego, Ficht's subject of original activity, and Hegel's world spirit is not the freedom of pleasurable possession with which the Aristotelian God moved in his own happiness. It is rather the freedom of interminable arduous labor, in the form that it assumes as authentic. Being in modern philosophy, reason has to produce itself, and its reality continuously is recalcitrant of material. It exists only in this process. What reason is to accomplish is neither more nor less than the constitution of the world for the ego. Reason is supposed to create the universality and community in which rational subjects participate with other rational subjects. It is the basis of the possibility that beyond the encounter of merely self-sufficient monads, a common life develops in a common world. But even this achievement does not lead beyond what already exists. It changes nothing, for the constitution of the world has always been effected prior to the actual action of the individual. Thus, he can never take his most authentic achievement into his own hands. The same characteristic agitation, which fears really taking what is and what making something else out of it, prevails in all aspects of this rationalism. Development is proclaimed, but true development is not a transformation or becoming something else, for at its core conclusion, it arrives at nothing that did not already exist in itself at the beginning. The absence of concrete development appears to this philosophy as the greatest benefit, precisely at its maturest stage. The anastatics of all its apparently so dynamic concepts become manifest. Undoubtedly, all these characteristics make idealist rationalism a bourgeois philosophy, and yet, merely on account of this single concept of reason, it is more than ideology. In devoting oneself to it, one does more than struggle against ideology. The concept of ideology has meaning only when oriented to the interest of theory and the transformation of the social structure. neither a sociological nor philosophical, but rather a political concept. It considers a doctrine in relation not to the social conditions of its truth, or to an absolute truth, but rather to the interest of transformation. Countless philosophical doctrines are mere ideology, and as illusions about socially relevant factors, readily integrate themselves into the general apparatus of domination. Idealist rationalism does not belong to this class precisely to the extent that it is really idealistic. The conception of the domination of being by reason is, after all, not only a postulant of idealism. With a sure instinct, the authoritarian state has fought classical idealism. Rationalism saw into important features of the bourgeois society: the abstract ego, abstract reason, apparent freedom. To what extent it is correct consciousness, pure reason was conceived as reason independent of all experience. The empirical world appears to make reason dependent. It manifests itself to reason with the character of foreignness. Limiting reason to pure theoretical and practical achievement implies an avowal of bad facticity, but also a concern with the rights of the individual, with that in him which is more than economic man, with what is left out of universal social exchange. Idealism tries to keep at least thought in a state of purity. It plays the peculiar doubt role of opposing both the true materialism of critical social theory and the false idealism of bourgeois practice. In idealism, the individual protests the world by making both himself and the world free and rational in the realm of thought. This philosophy is in an essential sense individualistic. However, it comprehends the individual's uniqueness in terms of his self-sufficiency and property. All attempts to use the subject construed in this sense as the basis for constructing an intersubjective world have a dubious character. The alter ego always can be linked to the ego only in an abstract manner. It remained a problem of pure knowledge or pure ethics. Idealism's purity, too, is equivocal. To be sure, the highest truth of theoretical and of practical reason were to be pure and not based on facticity, but this purity could be saved only on the condition that facticity be left in impurity. The individual is surrendered to his untruth. Nevertheless, concern for the individual long kept idealism from giving its blessing to the sacrifice of the individual to the service of false collectives. Rationalism's protest and critique remains idealistic and do not extend to the material conditions of existence. Hegel termed philosophy as abiding in the world of thought and essential determination. Although philosophy reconciles antithesis and reason, it provides a reconciliation not in reality, but in the world of ideas. The materialist protest and materialist critique originated in the struggle of oppressed groups for better living conditions and remain permanently associated with the actual process of this struggle. Western philosophy had established reason as authentic reality. In the bourgeois epoch, the reality of reason became the task that the free individual was to fulfill. The subject was the locus of reason and the source of the process by which the objectivity was to become rational. The material conditions of life, however, allotted freedom to reason only in pure thought and pure will. But a social situation has come about in which the realization of reason no longer needs to be restricted to pure thought and will. If reason means shaping life according to men's free decisions on the basis of their knowledge, then the demand for reason henceforth means the creation of a social organization in which individuals can collectively regulate their lives in accordance with their needs. With the realization of reason in such a society, philosophy would disappear. It was the task of social theory. That's the key thing here. It was the task of social theory to demonstrate this possibility and lay the foundation for a transformation of economic structure. By so doing, it could provide theoretical leadership for those strata which, by virtue of their historical situation, were to bring about the change. The interests of philosophy, concerned with man, have found its new form in the interests of critical social theory. There is no philosophy alongside and outside this theory, for the philosophical construction of reason is replaced by the creation of a rational society. The philosophical ideals of a better world and of true being are incorporated into the practical aim of struggling mankind where they take on a human form. What, however, if the development outlined by this theory does not occur? What if the forces that were to bring about the transformation are suppressed and appear to be defeated? Little as the theory's truth is thereby contradicted, it nevertheless appears then in a new light which illuminates new aspects and elements of its object. The new situation gives a new import to many demands and indices of the theory, whose strange function accords in it a more intensive sense the character of critical theory. Its critique is also directed at the avoidance of its full economic and political demands by many who invoke it. This situation compels theory anew to a sharper emphasis on its concern with the potentialities of man and the individual's freedom, happiness, and rights contained in all these analyses. For the theory, there are exclusive potentialities of the concrete social situation. They become relevant only as economic and political questions, and as such bear on human relations and the productive process. The distribution of the product of social labor and men's active participation in the economic and political administration of the whole. The more element of theory becomes reality, not only as the old order's evolution confirms the theory's prediction, but as the transition to the new order begins, the more urgent becomes the question of what the theory intended as its goal. For here, unlike in philosophical systems, human freedom is no phantom or arbitrary inwardness that leaves everything in the external world as it was. Rather, freedom here means a real potentiality, a social relationship on whose realization human destiny depends. At the given stage of development, the constructive character of a critical theory emerges anew. From the beginning, it did not more than simply register and systematize facts. Its impulse came from the force with which it spoke against the facts and confronted bad facticity with its better potentialities. Like philosophy, it opposes making reality into a criterion in the manner of complacent positivism, but unlike philosophy, it always derives its goal only from present tendencies of the social process. Therefore, it has no fear of the utopia that the new order is denounced as being. When truth cannot be realized within the established order, it always appears to the latter as mere utopia. That's a great way of putting it. The transcendent speaks not against, but for its truth. The utopian element was long the only progressive element in philosophy, as in the constructions of the best state and the highest pleasure of perfect happiness and perpetual peace. The obstinacy that comes from adhering to truth against all appearance has given way in contemporary philosophy to whimsy and uninhibited opportunism. Critical theory preserves obstinacy as a genuine quality of philosophical thought. The current situation emphasizes this quality. The reverse suffered by the progressive force took place at a stage where the economic conditions for transformation were present. The new social situation, expressed in the authoritarian state, could be easily comprehended and predicted by means of the concepts worked out by the theory. It was not the failure of economic concepts that provide the impetus behind a new emphasis on of the theory's claims that the transformation of economic conditions involved the transformation of the entirety of human existence. This claim is directed, rather, against a distorted interpretation and application of economics that is found in both practice and theoretical discussion. The discussion leads back to the question, in what way is the theory more than economics? From the beginning, the critique of political economy established the difference by criticizing the entirety of social existence. In a society whose totality was determined by economic relations, to the extent that the uncontrolled economy controlled the human relations, even the non-economic was contained in the economy. It appears that, if and when this control is removed, the rational organization of society toward which critical theory is oriented is more than a new form of economic regulation. The difference lies in the decisive factor, precisely the one that makes the society rational, the subordination of the economy to the individual's needs. The transformation of society eliminates the original relation of substructure and superstructure. In a rational reality, the labor process should not determine the general existence of men. To the contrary, their needs should determine the labor process. Not that the labor process is regulated in accordance with a plan, but the interest determining the regulation becomes important. It is rational only if the interest is that of the freedom and happiness of the masses. Neglect of this element despoils the theory of one of its essential characteristics. It eradicates from the image of liberated mankind the idea of happiness that was to distinguish it from all previous mankind. Without freedom and happiness in the social relations of men, even the greatest increase of production and the abolition of private property in the means of production remain infected with the old injustice. Critical theory has, of course, distinguished between various phases of realization and pointed out the unfreedoms and inequalities with which the new era inevitably will be burdened. Nevertheless, that transforms the social existence must be determined by its ultimate goal, even at its inception. In its concept of an ultimate goal, critical theory did not intend to replace the theological hereafter with a social one, with an ideal that appears in the new order as just another hereafter. In virtue of its existence, exclusive opposition to the beginning of its telescoping distance. By defending the endangered and victimized potentialities of man against cowardice and betrayal, critical theory is not to be supplemented by a philosophy. It only makes explicit what was always the foundation of its categories, the demand that through the abolition of previously existing material conditions of existence, the totality of human relations be liberated. If critical theory, amidst today's desperation, indices that the reality it intends must comprise the freedom and happiness of individuals, it is only following the direction given by economic concepts. They are constructive concepts which comprehend not only the given reality, but simultaneously its abolition in the new reality that is to follow. In the theoretical reconstruction of the social process, the critique of current conditions and the analysis of their tendencies necessarily include future-oriented components. The transformation towards which this process tends in existence that liberated mankind is to create for itself determines the outset the establishment and unfolding of the first economic categories. Theory can invoke no facts in confirmation of the theoretical element that point towards future freedom. From the viewpoint of theory, all that is already attained is given only as something threatened, and in the process of disappearing, the given is a positive fact, an element of the coming society, only when it is taken into the theoretical construction as something to be transformed. This construction is neither a supplement to nor an extension of economics. It is economics itself insofar as it deals with the contents that transcend the realm of established economic conditions. Unconditional adherence to its goal, which can be attained only in the social struggle, lets theory continually confront the already attained with, the not yet attained, and newly threatened. The theory's interest in great philosophy is part of the same context of opposition to the established order, but critical theory is not concerned with the realization of ideals brought into social struggle from outside. In these struggles, it identifies on one side the cause of freedom, and on the other side the cause of suppression and barbarism. If the latter seems to win in reality, it might easily appear as though critical theory were holding up a philosophical idea against factual development and then scientific analysis. Traditional science was in fact more subject to the powers that be than what was great philosophy. It was not in science but in philosophy that traditional theory developed concepts oriented to the potentialities of man lying beyond his factual status. At the end of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant cites the three questions in which all the interest of human reason coalesces. What can I know? What should I do? What may I hope? In the introduction of his lectures on logic, he adds a fourth question encompassing the first three. What is man? The answer to this question is conceived not as a description of human nature as it is actually found to be, but rather as a demonstration of what are found to be human potentialities. In the bourgeois period, philosophy distorted the meaning of both questions and answered by equating human potentialities with those that are real within the established order. That is why they could be potentialities only of pure knowledge and pure will. The transformation of a given status is not, of course, the business of philosophy. The philosopher can only participate in social struggles insofar as he is not a professional philosopher. This division of labor, too, results from the modern separation of the mental from the material means of production, and philosophy cannot overcome it. The abstract character of philosophical work in the past and present is rooted in the social conditions of existence. Adhering to the abstractness of philosophy is more appropriate to circumstances and closer to truth than it is to the pseudo-philosophical concreteness that condescends to social struggles. What is true in philosophical concepts was arrived at by abstracting from the concrete status of man and is true only in such abstraction. Reason, mind, morality, knowledge, and happiness are not only categories of bourgeois philosophy, but concerns of mankind. As such, they must be preserved, if not derived anew, when critical theory examines the philosophical doctrine in which it is still possible to speak of man. It deals first with the camouflage and misinterpretation that characterizes the discussion of man in the bourgeois period. With this intention, several fundamental concepts of philosophy have been discussed in this journal: truth and verification, rationalism and irrationalism, the role of logic, metaphysics and positivism, and the concept of essence. These were not merely analyzed sociologically, nor to correlate philosophical dogmas with social loci, nor were specific philosophical contents resolved in the social facts. To the extent that philosophy is more than ideology, every such attempt must come to naught. When critical theory comes in terms of philosophy, it is interested in the crucial content of philosophical concepts and problems. It presupposes that they really contain truth. The enterprise of the sociology of knowledge, to the contrary, is occupied only with the untruths, not the truths of previous philosophy. To be sure, even the highest philosophical categories are connected with social facts, even if only the most general fact, the struggle of man with nature, has been undertaken by mankind as a free subject, but instead has taken place only in class society. This fact comes to expression in many ontological differences established by philosophy. Its traces can perhaps be found even in the very form of conceptual thought. For example, in the determination of logic as essentially the logic of predication, or judgment about given objects of which predicates are variously asserted or denied. It was dialectical logic that first pointed out the shortcomings of this interpretation of judgment, the contingency of predication, and the externality of the process of judgment, which lets the subject of judgment appear outside as self-subsistent and predicate inside as though in our heads. Moreover, it is certainly true that many philosophical concepts are mere foggy ideas arising out of the domination of existence by an uncontrollable economy and accordingly are to be explained precisely by the material conditions of life. But in its historical forms, philosophy also contains insights into human and objective conditions whose truth points beyond previous societies and thus cannot be completely reduced to it. Here belongs not only the content dealt with under such concepts as reason, mind, freedom, morality, universality, and essence, but also important achievements of epistemology, psychology, and logic. Their truth content, which surmounts their social conditioning, presupposes not an eternal consciousness that transcendently constitutes the individual consciousness of historical subject, but only those particular historical subjects whose consciousness expresses itself in critical theory. It is only with and for this consciousness that the surpassing content becomes visible in its real truth. The truth that it recognizes in philosophy is not reducible to existing social conditions. This will be the case only in a form of existence where consciousness is no longer separated from being, enabling the rationality of thought to proceed from rationality of social existence. Until then, truth that is more than the truth of what can be attained and intended only in opposition to established social relations. To this negative conditions, at least, it is subject. In the past, social relations concealed the meaning of truth. They formed a horizon of untruth that deprived the truth of its meaning. An example is the concept of universal consciousness, which preoccupied German idealism. It contains the problem of the relation of the subject to the totality of society. How can universality as community become the subject without the abolishing individuality? The understanding that more than the epistemological or metaphysical problem is at issue here can be gained and evaluated only outside the limits of bourgeois thought. The philosophical solution met with by the problem are to be found in the history of philosophy. No sociological analysis is necessary in order to understand Kant's theory of transcendental synthesis. It embodies an epistemological truth. The interpretation given to the Kantian position by critical theory does not affect the internal philosophical difficulty. By connecting the problem of the universality of knowledge without a society as universal subject, it does not purport to provide a better philosophical solution. Critical theory means to show only the specific social conditions as the root of philosophy's inability to pose the problem in a more comprehensive way and to indicate that any other solution lay beyond the philosophy's boundary. The untruth inherent in all transcendental treatment of the problem thus comes into philosophy, from outside. Hence it can be overcome only outside philosophy. Outside does not mean that social factors affect consciousness from without as though the latter existed independently. It refers rather to a division within the social whole. Consciousness is externally conditioned by social existence to the very extent that in bourgeois society, the social conditions of the individual are external to him, as it were, overwhelm him from without. This externality made possible the abstract freedom of the thinking subject. Consequently, only its abolition would enable abstract freedom to disappear as part of the general transformation of the relationship between social being and consciousness. If the theory's fundamental conception of the relation of social existence to consciousness is to be followed, this outside must be taken into consideration. Its previous history there has been no pre-established harmony between correct thought and social being. In the bourgeois period, economic conditions determine philosophical thought insofar as it is emancipated, self-reliant individuals who thinks. In reality, he counts not in the concretion of his potentialities and need, but only in the abstract from his individuality as the bearer of labor power, i.e. of useful functions in the process of the realization of capital. Correspondingly, he appears in philosophy only as an abstract subject, abstracted from his full humanity. If he pursues the idea of man, he must think in opposition to facticity. Wishing to conceive his ideas in its philosophical purity and universality, he must abstract from the present state of affairs. This abstractness, this radical withdrawal from the given, at least clears a path along which the individual in bourgeois society can seek the truth and adhere to what is known. Besides concreteness and facticity, the thinking subject also leaves its misery outside, but it cannot escape from itself, for it has incorporated the monadic isolation of the bourgeois individual into its premises. The subject thinks within a horizon of untruth that bars the door to real emancipation. This horizon explains some of the characteristic features of bourgeois philosophy. One of them affects the idea of truth itself, and would seem to relativize sociologically all its truths from the start. The coupling of truth and certainty. As such, this connection goes all the way back to ancient philosophy, but only in the modern period has it taken on the typical form that truth must prove itself as a guaranteed property of the individual, and that this proof is considered established only if the individual can continually reproduce the truth as his own achievement. The process of knowledge is never terminated, because in every act of cognition, the individual must once again reenact the production of the world and the categorical organization of experience. However, the process never gets any further, because the restriction of productive cognition to the transcendental sphere makes any new form of the world impossible. The constitution of the world occurs behind the backs of individuals, yet it is their work. The corresponding social factors are clear. The progressive aspect of this construction of the world, namely the foundation of knowledge on this autonomy of the individual and the idea of cognition as an act and task to be continually reenacted, are made ineffective by the life process of bourgeois society. But does this sociological limitation affect the true content of the construction, the essential connection of knowledge, freedom, and in practice? Bourgeois society's domination reveals itself not only in the dependence of thought, but also in the abstract independence of its contents. For this society determines consciousness, such as the latter's activity and content survive in the dimension of abstract reason. Abstractness saves its truth. What is true is so only to the extent that it is not the truth about social reality. And just because it is not the latter, because it transcends this reality, it can become a matter for critical theory. Sociology, that is interested only in the dependent and limited nature of consciousness, has nothing to do with truth. Its research, useful in many ways, falsifies the interest in the goal of critical theory. In any case, what was linked in past knowledge to specific social structures disappears with them. In contrast, critical theory concerns itself with preventing the loss of the truths which past knowledge labored to attain. This is not to assert the existence of eternal truths unfolding in the changing historical forms of which they need only to be divested in order for their kernel of truth to be revealed. If reason, freedom, knowledge, and happiness really are transformed from abstract concepts into reality, then they will have as much and as little in common with the previous forms as their associations of free men with competitive production of commodity-producing society. Of course, the identity of the basic social structures in previous history certainly corresponds an identity of certain universal truths, whose universal character is an essential component of their true content. The struggle of authoritarian ideology against abstract universals has clearly exhibited this, that man is a rational being. that this being requires freedom, and that happiness is his highest good, are all universal propositions, whose progressive impetus derives precisely from their universality. Universality gives them an almost revolutionary character, for they claim that all, and not merely this or that particular person, should be rational, free, and happy. In a society whose reality gives the lie to all these universals, philosophy cannot make them concrete. Under such conditions, adherence to universality is more important than its philosophical destruction. Critical theorist interest in the liberation of mankind binds it to certain ancient truths. It is at one with philosophy in maintaining that man can be more than a manipulatable subject in the production process of class society. To the extent that the philosophy can nevertheless make its peace with man's determination by economic conditions, it has allied itself with repression. That is, the bad materialism that underlies the edifice of idealism, the consolation that in the material world everything is in order as it is, even when it has not been the personal conviction of the philosopher. This consolation has arisen almost automatically out of the mode of thought of the bourgeois idealism, and constitutes its ultimate affinity with its time. The other premise of this materialism is that the mind is not to make its demand in this world, but is to orient itself towards another realm that does not conflict with the material world. The materialism bourgeois practice can be quite easily come to terms with this attitude. The bad materialism of philosophy is overcome in the materialist theorist society. The latter opposes not only the production relations that give rise to bad materialism, but every form of production that dominates man instead of being dominated by him. This idealism underlies its materialism. Its constructive concepts, too, have a residue of abstractness as long as the reality towards which they are directed is not yet given. Here, however, abstractness results not from avoiding the status quo, but from the orientation towards the future status of man. It cannot be supplanted by another, correct theory of the established order. An idealist abstractness was replaced by the critique of political economy. It cannot be succeeded by a new theory, but only by rational reality itself. The abyss between rational and present reality cannot be bridged by conceptual thought. In order to maintain what is not yet present as a goal in the present, fantasy is required. The essential connection of fantasy with philosophy is evident from the function attributed to it by philosophers, especially Aristotle and Kant, under the title of imagination. Owing to its unique capacity to intuit an object through the latter, being not present to create something new out of given material of cognition, imagination denotes a considerable degree of independence from the given of freedom amid a world of unfreedom. In surpassing what is present, it can anticipate the future. It is true that when Kant characterizes this fundamental faculty of the human soul as the a priori basis of all knowledge, this restriction to the a priori diverts once again from the future to what is always past. Imagination succumbs to the general degradation of fantasy. To free it for the construction of a more beautiful and happier world remains the prerogative of children and fools. True, in fantasy one can imagine anything, but critical theory does not envision an endless horizon of possibilities. The freedom of imagination disappears to the extent that real freedom becomes a real possibility. The limits of fantasy are thus no longer a universal law of essence, as the last bourgeois theory of knowledge that took seriously the meaning of fantasy so described them, but technical limits in the strictest sense. They're prescribed by the level of technological development. What critical theory is engaged in is not the depiction of a future world, although the response of fantasy to such a challenge would not perhaps be quite as absurd as we are led to believe. If fantasy were set free to answer with precise reference to already existing technical material, the fundamental philosophical question asked by Kant, all sociology would be terrified at the utopian character of its answer. And yet, the answers that fantasy could provide would be very close to the truth, certainly closer than those yielded by the rigorous conceptual analyses of the philosophical anthropology. For it would determine what man is on the basis of what he really can be tomorrow. In replying to this question, what may I hope, it would be pointless to eternal bliss in inner freedom than to the already possible unfolding and fulfillment of needs and wants. In a situation where such a future is a real possibility, fantasy is an important instrument in the task of continually holding the goal up to view. Fantasy does not relate to the other cognitive faculties as illusion of truth, which in fact, when it plumes itself on being the only truth, can only perceive the truth of the future only as illusion. Without fantasy, all philosophical knowledge remains in the grip of the present or the past and severed from the future, which is the only link between philosophy and the real history of mankind. Strong emphasis on the role of fantasy seems to contradict the rigorously scientific character that critical theory has always made a criterion of its concepts. This demand for scientific objectivity has brought materialist theory into unusual accord with idealist rationalism. While the latter could pursue its concern with man only in abstraction from given facts, it attempts to undo this abstractness by associating itself with science. Science never seriously called use value into question. In their anxiety with scientific objectivity, the Neo-Kantians are at one with Kant, as is Husserl with Descartes. How science was applied, whether its utility and productivity guarantees its higher truth, or were instead signs of general inhumanity, philosophy did not ask itself these questions. It was chiefly interested in the methodology of the sciences. The critical theory of society maintained primarily that the only task left for philosophy was elaborating the most general results of the sciences. It, too, took as its basis the viewpoint that science has sufficiently demonstrated its ability to serve the development of the productive forces and open new potentialities of richer existence. But while the alliance between the idealist philosophy and science was burdened from the beginning with sins engendered by the dependence of sciences on established relations of domination, a critical theory of society presupposes the disengagement of science from this order. Thus, the fateful fetishism of science is avoided here in principle, but this does not dispense of the theory from a constant critique of scientific aims and methods which takes into account every new social situation. Scientific objectivity as such is never a sufficient guarantee of truth, especially in a situation where the truth speaks as strongly against the fact and is as well hidden behind them as today. Scientific predictability does not coincide with the futuristic mode in which the truth exists. Even the development of the productive forces and the evolution of technology knows no uninterrupted progression from the old to the new society. From here, too, man himself is to determine progress, not socialist man whose spiritual and moral regeneration is supposed to constitute the basis for planning and planners, a view that overlooks that socialist planning presupposes the disappearance of the abstract separation, both of the subject from his activity and of the subject as the universal from each individual subject, but the association of those men who bring about the transformation, since what is to become of science and technology depends on them. Science and technology cannot serve a priori as a conceptual model for critical theory. Critical theory is last but not least critical of itself and of the social forces that make up its own basis. The philosophical element in which the theory is a form of protest against the new economism, which would isolate the economic struggle and separate the economic from the political sphere. At an early stage, this view was countered with the criticism that the determining factors are the given situation or of the entire society, the interrelation of the various social strata, and relations of political power. The transformation of the economic structure must so reshape the organization of the entire society that with the abolition of economic antagonisms between group and individuals, the political sphere becomes to a great extent independent and determines the development of society. With the disappearance of the state, political relations would then become, in a hitherto unknown sense, general human relations, the organization of the administration of social wealth in the interest of liberated mankind. Materialist theory of society is originally a 19th century theory, representing its relations to irrationalism as one of inheritance. It conceives this much inheritance as it manifested itself in the 19th century. Much has changed since then. At the same time, the theory had comprehended on the deepest level the possibility of a coming barbarity, but the latter did not appear to be as imminent as the conservative abolition of what the 19th century represented. Conservative of what the culture of bourgeois society, for all its poverty and injustice, had accomplished nonetheless for the development and happiness of the individual. What it had already achieved and what still remains to be done was clear enough. The entire impetus of the theory came from this interest in the individual, and it was not necessary to discuss it philosophically. The situation of inheritance had changed in the meantime. It is not a part of the 19th century, but authoritarian barbarity that now separates the previous reality of reason from the form intended by theory. More and more, the culture that was to have been abolished recedes into the past, overlaid by an actuality in which the complete sacrifice of the individual has become a pervasive and almost unquestioned fact of life. That culture has vanished to the point where students in comprehending it is no longer a mistake of spiteful pride, but of sorrow. Critical theory must concern itself to the hitherto unknown extent to which the past, precisely insofar as is concerned with the future. In a different form, the situation confronting the theory of society in the 19th century is being repeated today. Once again, real conditions fall beneath the general level of history. Fettering the productive forces and keeping down the standards of life is characteristic of even economically most developed countries. The reflection cast by the truth of the future in the philosophy of the past provides indications of factors that point beyond today's anachronistic conditions. Thus, critical theory is still linked to these truths. They appear in it as part of a process that of bringing to the consciousness potentialities that have emerged within the maturing historical situation. They are preserved in economic and political concepts of critical theory.